Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual listening session with the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee, which is being live streamed on the DNC's YouTube channel. I'm Jim Roosevelt, and I co-chair the Rules and Bylaws Committee, colloquially referred to as the RBC, which serves as the committee within the DNC entrusted with designing the 2024 presidential nominating process and calendar. I'm joined today by Minyan Moore, who was recently appointed as our new co-chair. Minyan is formerly CEO of the DNC and brings a deep understanding of the work ahead of us, as well as the technical understanding to support our conversations and decisions. Before serving as CEO of the DNC, Minyan was President Clinton's assistant to the president and director of White House political affairs, where she served as the principal political advisor to the president, the vice president, the first lady, and senior White House staff. She also developed and coordinated legislative strategy, administration policy, and communications planning with senior White House staff. I am certainly looking forward to working with Minyan in this capacity. We've worked together in many other capacities in the past, and I'd like to invite her to say a few words before we dive into today's session.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I am indeed honored to be a part of this process. I have had the honor and privilege of serving on RBC for a number of years, and I tell you, it is very humbling to be asked to serve in a role as co-chair. I'd first like to thank our chairman, Chairman Harrison, for this appointment. I am deeply honored that you saw fit to ask me, and one, because I know the person that I am filling her shoes is indeed an honored and respected member of the DNC, and that's Lorraine Miller. I have watched Lorraine and Jim serve with distinction, integrity, and fairness on this committee, and I only hope that I will be able to bring the same integrity, the same level of transparency and honesty to this process. Again, thank you, Chairman Harrison, for this spectacular honor. And I want to be able to say it was spectacular at the end of this process. Jim, I will be looking to you as my mentor, as you have been for many years, and as you have been for many years to many people on this committee. I look forward to serving the DNC just one more time. Thank you very much. And I am honored to be a part of this process.
Well, thank you, Minyan. And I want to explain to everybody that I will be back on camera in a little while. I had the pleasure of being given some tickets behind home plate for this afternoon's Red Sox game, and I'm in a car right now on the way home from that. So when I get home, I'll join you on the computer. As we move through today's session, Minyan and I will be serving as your MCs, and I'm going to turn it over to Minyan to introduce our esteemed and beloved chair, Jaime Harrison.
Thank you, Jim. Before we review the RBC's process to date and begin our speaking program, we are indeed, as Jim said, joined by a very special guest. I also get the privilege of saying that he is my friend. He's a lifelong Democrat. He's always fighting for a better, fairer, and brighter future for America. As the DNC chair, he's a driving force in the success of our party, and he continues to work to build the next generation of Democratic talent, which we all know is so very important for our party. We are honored to have DNC Chairman Jaime Harris with us today. Mr. Chairman, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Co-Chair. It is so good seeing you. And Minyan, I cannot tell you how overjoyed I am that you agreed to accept the co-leadership of this very, very important committee for the Democratic National Committee. The work that you all will do continues to make history and lays a foundation for who we are as a party. And so there is nobody more qualified to be in this role. You're a veteran member of the RBC. You've worked at the highest levels of our government, from the White House to being the CEO of the DNC. And we are so grateful for your leadership, so grateful for your experience. And I personally am so grateful for your friendship. So thank you so much for agreeing to be the co-chair of the Rules and Bylaws Committee. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you for stepping up for the party one more time. And I want to thank Lorraine Miller as well. Lorraine is a dear friend and a mentor. I first met her when I was a young staffer on Capitol Hill, and she was in the office of Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Lorraine had worked for, I think, at least 3 speakers prior to that, and she eventually became the first African-American clerk of the House of Representatives. But her storied career, from working in the White House to being the head of the NAACP, is legendary. And we're going to miss her on this committee, but she's still a viable and important member of the DNC. And so I'm very, very grateful for her as well. And of course, Jim Roosevelt, who is our long-term leader, one of the leaders of this committee. Jim understands and has probably forgotten more about what the DNC has done and the rules of the DNC than people have ever known in terms of their entirety of their lives. And so I appreciate his leadership and his stewardship as well. Folks, welcome. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here and for sharing your input and perspectives today. I want to recognize our Party Affairs staff for putting this series of listening sessions together. And I also want to thank all of our RBC members for conducting a transparent and inclusive process. Now, while we won't be making any decisions until our summer meeting, today is one of several opportunities to provide historical context, highlight important parts of this process, and to make sure that all of the diverse constituencies that make up our party have a clear window into the process. We'll hear from a variety of speakers today and in the weeks and months ahead. And all of us at the DNC are committed to a process that brings as many voices as possible to the table and demonstrates our values each step of the way. This process is a great opportunity for our party, encouraging states to highlight their strengths, encouraging states to share the ways that they embody Democratic Party values. These things give us a powerful chance to highlight why it is so important that we elect Democrats at every level, in every state, all across the country and in our territories. So thank you all again for being here, and thank you for everything you do for the Democratic Party. And I want to thank our speakers today for joining us as well. Jim and Mignon, back to you.
Thank you, Chair Harrison. This committee that Mignon and I co-chair, the Rules and Bylaws Committee, is entrusted with defining the rules for the party's presidential nominating contest by drafting the delegate selection rules and the call to the convention. The RBC has been meeting monthly to develop the 2024 delegate selection rules. I know that sounds a little amazing given that it's only early 2022, but that's the way the process works. And to develop the resulting nominating process in a way that reflects the diversity of the party and that ultimately produces the strongest possible Democratic nominee for president. After the delegate selection rules are approved by the DNC this fall, each state party will develop its written delegate selection plan. The RBC will review the plan for compliance with the rules, including a rule that dictates the timing of presidential primaries and caucuses. Since 1980, the DNC's delegate selection rules have permitted each state party to determine when to hold its primary or caucus, as long as the date of those contests falls within a predetermined window. Traditionally, the RBC has exempted Iowa and New Hampshire, and beginning in 2008, also Nevada and South Carolina, creating a pre-window set of nominating contests. The members of this committee are committed to taking a critical look at all aspects of the nominating process, as we do every 4 years, including how the pre-window states are selected and exempted. To that end, the committee recently approved a resolution that allows this RBC to set up a selection process for up to 5 states to hold early contests based on a set of criteria that includes diversity, competitiveness in the general election, and the ability to administer a transparent and verifiable process. In striving to create a truly inclusive process, the RBC also agreed to hold 4 virtual public hearings in which party stakeholders are given the opportunity to voice their views on the pre-window schedule. The purpose of the listening sessions is to create an official record of input on the pre-window schedule from Democratic Party stakeholders who do not have an official platform to provide their comments, such as at a regular RBC meeting. These sessions will allow our constituencies an opportunity to provide RBC members with insights on how to ensure a diverse, inclusive, and transparent process. And while our speaking time is limited during each session, the DNC has added a portal to its website for all interested parties to submit testimony for the RBC's review. You'll receive a link to that portal in an email as a follow-up to this listening session. Before we begin, would you like to add anything, Mignon?
Thank you, Jim. Well, as you know, we cannot do our work without the great staff of the DNC. So I would like to acknowledge the team helping to facilitate this session. We have the staff of the Office of Party Affairs and Delegate Selection, Office Assistant Jenna Whitaker, our advisor, whom we all know and love, Rick Boylan, our newest director, Veronica Martinez-Roman. We also greatly appreciate all the help from our DNC counsel, Graham Wilson, and Adrian Levine. This program was also supported by ASDC, the DNC coalitions, research, mobilization, the political departments, and the Secretary's office. Thank you all for making sure that all people who want to be invited to have a role in this party will be included. Thank you very much. And with that, if you have any questions about the work of the DNC, the Rules and Bylaws Committee, please don't hesitate to contact our team. Now let's begin our listening session. Jim and I will call on speakers who will offer remarks, then answer any questions the RBC members may have for them. Once there are no more questions, we will move to the next speaker. I believe we have our first speaker here, Dr. Nadia Brown. Dr. Brown is a professor of government, chair of Women's and Gender Studies program, and affiliate in the African American Studies program at Georgetown University. She specializes in Black women's politics and holds a graduate certificate in Women's and Gender Studies. Dr. Brown's research interest lies broadly in identity politics, legislative studies, and Black women's studies. Her scholarship on intersectionality seeks to think more holistically about the politics of identity. Dr. Brown, we are honored to have you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation to share my research and to talk to you a little bit about Black women's experiences with the Democratic Party. What I'm going to talk to you today is drawing from an article that I wrote with my co-author and colleague, Danielle Lemmy, that appeared in the 2020 issue of the Boston University Law Review. And I'm happy to share this paper with anyone. If you're interested, I can put my email in the chat, and you can email me and I can send you the paper. So the name of this paper is Life for Me Ain't Been No Crystal Stair, Black Women Candidates in the Democratic Party. So what I'll do here, Francis, is set the stage and then tell you a little bit about the kind of the research that I do and the findings that I have. So on the onset, I am an ethnographer. That means that I talk to people. I particularly talk to Black women, political candidates, and office holders. And as a Black woman, I translate their experiences through a culturally sensitive lens that is based in a Black feminist ethos to larger academic audiences and to the mass public, trying to make their narratives more heard and seen. I'm not speaking for these women, but I am translating their words to a larger audience. So I'll start with just to set the scene. In 1939, Crystal Dorita Bird Fawcett became the first duly elected Black woman to earn a seat in the state legislature. Now, Bird Fawcett was an advocate for women's rights. She was dedicated to a life of public service and political action. She organized the Philadelphia Democratic Women's League, and in 1936, she became the director of Black women's activities for the National Democratic Committee. The Philadelphia Record at the time reported that she was charged with selling the Roosevelt humanitarianism to Negro housewives. But she later ran for the Pennsylvania legislature as a Democrat with the support of party leadership. She was a close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt and assisted President Franklin Roosevelt's reelection campaign. However, she resigned from the Democratic National Committee due to a dispute with party leadership, and she switched her support to Governor Thomas Dewey, a Republican candidate for president. Now, Bird Fawcett's partisan experiences speak to the tenuous relationship with party leadership that other Black women political elites have faced. And when she ultimately became disenchanted with the party politics, she remained active in political pursuits for the remainder of her life. So in this paper, I use this setup to kind of explain what was the impediment to how was the Democratic Party an impediment to Bird Fawcett's political career? But the question that largely animates the work is, how do Black women candidates view their experiences within the Democratic Party? And so what we find in this paper is that the Democratic Party has been a source of frustration for many Black women in American politics, just like they were for Bird Fawcett back in 1939. And to do this, I draw from data collected from focus groups with Black women political elites to argue that the Democratic Party is largely seen as impeding on their electoral victories. By centering the narratives of Black women political elites, I hope to elucidate how they have had to navigate the Democratic Party, either as a stepping stone or a stumbling block. In the view of the participants of the study, the Democratic Party, in essence, is practicing a form of electoral disenfranchisement that is seemingly based on race and gender of the candidate. So we identified three themes of how the Democratic Party animates their relationship to electoral politics. The first is that the party as gatekeeper and player of racial politics. 2, the party as a contributor to the emotional hurt and misgivings. And 3, the women's displaying agency is a desire to push back against the party. And so, as you all know here in this Zoom room, there are more Democratic women in government than Republican women across all ethno-racial groups. And there's a large partisan gap, meaning that there is more women of color that are elected. And that's largely because of the Democratic Party, right? Particularly within state legislatures. We know that that Democratic women outpace elected Republican women as colleagues. So while the Democratic women have been steadily increasing their presence in electoral positions, discussions on the intersections between gender and ethno-racial identity alongside partisan dynamics have largely been absent. So that's what I seek to do here in this paper, is to shed light on this. And this is important because Black women have enjoyed significant electoral success as Democrats, although they face unique challenges because of their race and gender. But this pessimistic view of Black women candidacies do not fully depict their electoral experiences. Because Black women have outpaced Black men and white women in winning electoral seats, the perception of Black women as always disadvantaged due to racism and sexism is most likely inaccurate. And so we know that Black women display higher levels of political ambition than candidates from other social groups. And they do so to win. They draw from pre-existing political and organizational networks that enable them to win electoral office, often with scant resources from party support. Furthermore, Black women's long tradition in community leadership, religious networks, and movement politics has provided the necessary expertise and pathways for their electoral success. And so by viewing the positionality of Black women candidates within the Democratic Party, what I hope to show here is that while the party has relied on support of Black women's vote since the New Deal realignment, in some ways they have left Black women candidates unsupported. And so again, the question that animates this research is, how do Black women candidates view their experiences within the Democratic Party? So to undertake this research, Danielle, my co-author, and I collected data with the Black Women's Political Action Committee of Texas. We did this in 2019. And this is an organization that seeks to support the political ambitions of Black women in Texas. And I can talk a little bit about who was there and some of the demographics in the room definitely matter. The women were running from offices in their city council, their county council, whereas judgeships, the state legislature, and even one woman was running for lieutenant governor. What we did in this study was we used a focus group method, and we think that it's optimal for a couple of reasons. First, it's really a conversation among similar individuals that really encourages candidateness, right? So they're comfortable to discuss these kind of sensitive topics more, though, if they were just me as an interviewer, who is this outside person, right, that hasn't run for office, doesn't understand the ins and outs of running for office, and through a lived experience. Also, it's really useful for me as a researcher because it allows me to observe this group dynamic that really evolves out of this conversation. And again, this is a dynamic that doesn't happen in a single participant interviewer. And so because of this, we were able to really play on how the women were talking with and to one another, and also how they were engaging with me. Okay, so let's talk about the three main findings from the research. Well, first is the Democratic Party as gatekeeping and playing racial politics. So this is a common theme that the participants really spoke the most about, was the lack of party support. So I'll give you some examples by reading direct quotes from what the women shared with me. And on the onset, these are all pseudonyms. I'm not referring to these women by name, but I will provide you with a little bit of context of who they are. So this woman that we're calling Tabitha was a middle-aged retired military veteran who was running for governor, lieutenant governor. And she shared that she was engaged in heavy canvassing across the state, often speaking with Black women voters in rural counties, who told her that they had never been contacted by a government official or a candidate for elected office. And to this, she said, you would think that your party would be leading you or guiding you or helping or supporting you. And I'm not saying that there aren't people out there that are trying, because of course, there are people that are trying. But there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done in our party system. And I mean, from the national party all the way to the local party. Rachel, another participant in our study, agreed with her. And Rachel was a more senior woman in the focus group who responded to Tabitha's issues with the Democratic Party by saying, well, to me, there's layers to this. And that's why the more you're into politics, the more you get to see these layers. So you start seeing the big picture. And the big picture, there are differences between the local party, the state party, and the national party. And as Black women, we really need to develop that on our outside, out of the party system, our own leadership plot line for people to run for office. That's why Black women's political practices are so important. We can do that. And then she noted that Black women need to form their own coalitions as a means for political advancement. Rachel reiterated this similar point other times around the conversation, because she believes that Black women often have to go at it alone without the party's backing, and that they should support each other as Black women candidates. Other women, such as Grace in the study, shared that there were informal rules for Black political leadership around the country in order to run a successful campaign. And that would mean that women had to run in their turn, and that there were Black political elites who bestowed power, who bestowed the right to run, that they were power brokers within the party themselves. And you sometimes had to play this double standard of how do I address the Black leadership within the political party, and then how do I address the larger political party? And this was particularly true for Blacks who were running in majority Black districts, while sometimes that happens in white majority districts. And Rachel, again, as an older Black woman who was part of the leadership in her local Democratic Party, really took exception to that. And she said, I don't think that a lot of people are out here moving here or listening to older Black elected power. They're more independent with their votes than they were 10 years ago. And I don't know if it's as meaningful as it was, but you still have to maneuver these power politics if you want to be elected. The next recurring theme that was very, very prevalent in the research was the Democratic Party hurt and misgivings. So several of the women in the focus groups mentioned that Black women are a reliable voting bloc for the Democratic Party, and that the party should support Black women candidates because of this. So for an example, there was a feeling by some of the more vocal members of the focus groups that the Democratic Party had taken them for granted or assumed that they would be loyal voters. Pamela, an older woman a millennial who was running for office who was a single mother of 2 young kids, was mounting her first race for position on her city council. And she said, but I think that because I found it to be very hurtful, and I'm angry, because I found that in my party is that they always want to talk to you about how we're the biggest voting bloc, but they don't want to give you a position. They select who and what they want. They handpicked who and what they want. And then she went on to explain to me and also talk with the other members of the focus group that the winner of the Democratic primary normally wins the general election in her district. And the Democrats run competitive primaries, and the party supports candidates at the midpoint of the race that they think is more viable. And so for Pamela, the term viable was loaded. And in practice, the Democratic Party has always seen white candidates viable in her city, rather than other Black or Latinx candidates. Because the party bestows support for the candidate midway through the election, and other candidates often don't receive the resources to combat the party support for the chosen candidate. And this for her was a main problem. So what she did to surmount that was she continued to do a grassroots style campaign. She and her children would knock on doors in the evenings and on weekends and ask residents for their votes. She leveraged her personal networks, such as her church, her friendship circles, and her sorority to help get out the vote. But the frustration in Pamela's narrative was noticeably felt by the other participants in the focus groups. She also added, at times, even though they look at us as important people to the party, I'm talking about Black women, and they're like, is she electable? The statement drew amens and ahas from the women in the group. Adele, who was another millennial candidate seeking a judgeship, co-signed Pamela's point by stating, the party wants your time, energy, and money. And accordingly, as voters and grassroots organizers, the Democratic Party values Black women. But she went on to say that doesn't ring true for all Black women candidates. Have to make sure that your race is critical. And if you're critical, they're going to give you the time. They're going to give you the energy. But how does your race become critical if the party doesn't support you in the primary? And so while others in the focus group spoke up about this, some share that they didn't have those same personal experiences, but they have heard lots of things similar to this. And they also harken back to some racist and sexist things that had happened in their own campaigns that they thought they would get some support from the party. And then they also reiterated that, again, Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party. And the final part of this section is that the party was seen as unable to see Black women as electable. And this was a common frustration expressed with the focus group members, and even those who held position of power within their own local Democratic Party. And lastly, Black women see the Democratic Party through their own pushback and agency. And I really want to stress this here because this is as much about structure as agency. So while mounting a successful campaign with little to no party support has been challenging, Black women candidates demonstrate that they're forging their own paths to electoral success. And they gave several examples on their own communities where Black women have won election and re-election because of their own endeavors. And that the primary thing that the women wanted to leave off with, so the Democratic Party should not be the obstacle that prohibits one's political ambition. And so one woman, Tabitha, again said, but if it's going to keep you from doing what you're called to do, we've got to move on from that. You got to do what you got to do. We got to keep going and not bow down to other people saying, oh, you're supposed to be doing that? But seriously, who are you? And Michelle, another woman in the focus group who was running for a judgeship in this cycle, but had run for statewide elected office in a previous cycle, said that Black women are basically powerhouses in the National Democratic Party, and that we have to remember that Black women have reached incredible heights within Democratic Party leadership, and that local women can look to these national leaders for inspiration. And she went on to name a cadre of national leaders. She also recommended books and resources to help the women. And she shared that Black women need to have leaders, they need to have mentors, and they also have to prioritize rest and the ability to retool. And these lessons that are offered around electoral disappointment can highlight the importance of having these sister circles, these sister networks where they can talk with one another. So to conclude and to wrap this up, the Black women in the focus group were really vocal about articulating the difficulties as running for Black women within the Democratic Party. They openly shared that Democratic Party politics left them with deep emotional pain, compelling them to strategize without the party support. But in the end, they turned to this optimistic tone, right? Particularly from the younger participants in the focus group. They seem to want to share their narratives in a way of offering the next generation a lesson in perseverance. So there's a couple of takeaways, right? The first thing is that the Democratic Party's poor treatment or perceived poor treatment of Black women may provide an opening for the Republican Party to recruit this powerful group of voters and candidates. Now, again, that's of course, if the Republican Party were to advance a set of policy priorities that were more attractive to ethno-racial communities and women, that could signal party realignment, right? Again, that's a long shot. But Black women might be open to being recruited to elected positions as Republican. This is a distant possibility, but it is one worth noting. Next, the narratives of the women in the study speak to the ubiquitous nature of the Democratic Party as both an obstacle at the local, state, and national levels that they all must overcome. Other Black women with similar experiences should not take their party's ambivalence as a personal attack, but instead they might find solace in knowing that other women have had similar experiences with the Democratic Party. And to conclude, right, as the women in my study show, it's not simply enough to allow historically marginalized groups into the fold, but rather the political system must eradicate prohibitive structures that limit full and equal participation. Thank you.
Dr. Brown, you have given us so much to think about, and I am sure many of the members are going to request your paper, so please have it handy and ready to disseminate. So with that, I'll ask if any members of the RBC or any members have any questions, and if so, Veronica will let us know the names of the members, and after the last question, we will move on to the next speaker that Jim will introduce. Sorry about the static.
I'm not seeing any hands just yet. No hands.
Again, thank you, Dr. Brown. That was really, really informative information.
Thank you for the time and space.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. And I think that I am now no longer just a name. I think that now that I've gotten home, I'm also a live presence. Our next speaker is Longoria, the former Biden for President Deputy Director from the great state of Texas. With over a decade of experience, Jenn is now based in San Antonio and specializes in campaign field, data, and management. Prior to Biden for President, she served as the Texas director for the Warren for President campaign. She has trained volunteers and staff from organizations across the state, including Texas Freedom Network, New Leaders Council, the Texas Democratic Party, the Houston Justice Coalition, NARAL, and AFIRE. Jenn, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Let me make sure that I am not muted. Okay. I want to thank the Rules and Bylaws Committee for providing the opportunity for stakeholders like myself to share insights into how they can ensure a diverse, inclusive, and transparent process moving forward. As a Latina working to strengthen the Democratic Party in the great state of Texas, I can say from experience that the pre-window process has an enormous impact on the success or failure of Democratic candidates in a state that's home to the largest Black population, the second largest Latino population, and the third largest Asian population in the country. So while it can seem really exhausting sometimes to witness the primary campaign timeline lengthen with each presidential cycle, the fact remains that the critical time spent preparing for that state must prepare our candidates for more than just that state. On a practical level, I work with volunteers, and that's been the bulk of my career, working with volunteers on the ground, working with community leaders, county party chairs, to make sure that we are trying to build up the infrastructure that we can in Texas. So on that practical level, the committee's ability to identify a first in the nation state is going to determine the foundation for resources used for every Democratic campaign throughout the cycle. For example, because staff hiring is tailored to the needs of the first in the nation state, and then transitioning that staff to subsequent states, the diversity and the size of the staff originally trained directly impacts our party's ability to organize in diverse communities across the country. So, as a state that is not in that free window, a lot of the resources that we receive are, things that were originally structured for those initial states. That impacts how we are able to begin our contest, how early we're able to begin our contest, and how invasively we're able to really contact all of our grassroots leaders, and really engage people that need to come into the Democratic Party. So other resources that play a critical role in our success are translated materials. So over 25 million people over the age of 5 speak a language other than English in Texas. But 6 million of those are non-Spanish speakers. So our process has got to include, got to ensure that candidates are prepared to reach out to Latinos, yes, but they've got to also be able to reach out to our Vietnamese community, our Chinese community, our Tagalog community, and our Arabic community, making sure that the structure and the very foundation of our pre-window campaigns have those qualities and ability to reach those communities is absolutely crucial to success in states like Texas. So finally, choosing a state diverse enough to provide polling conducted for racially, culturally, and geographic diverse populations is absolutely important. It'll ultimately strengthen our data pipelines, our messaging, and being able to communicate with communities that have not ever been considered before. For instance, our rural Black communities in East Texas, or our rural Latino communities in West Texas. So I am going to be brief. I just wanted to make sure that, we were able to give a little bit of a comment for the Rules Committee. I understand that this process is exciting but daunting. So thank you for your work. I'm open to any questions, but also ready to move on and hear what the rest of the speakers have to say as well.
Ms. Longoria, does anyone have any questions? Actually, would you tell us, in a state as diverse as Texas, when you look at a community that is characterized in a single way, but as diverse as the Latino community is, how do you recommend that the party and candidates deal with the diversity among communities like that?
I think that is one of the, I understand this is not a lobby for your state, but I will say that that is one of the benefits to having Texas as a pre-window state. We know that the Latino community is not a monolith. We know that regionally our community differs. So being able to compete in Texas early on is an opportunity for our candidates to really have to be knowledgeable about what issues are affecting communities based on the environment or their environments. So talking about the border, not just in terms of immigration, but also in terms of healthcare and trade and economics. These are the things that people in those communities are talking about. So it's hard when we're hearing messages from outside of Texas about us. I think the key is having candidates here to listen. And I think that pre-window timeline offers that opportunity.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Ms. Longoria? Veronica, do you have any questions in the queue?
Am I seeing none? No, none.
Okay, very interesting presentation. I want to tell you, Jenn, how much I admire your typewriter. We can explain to some of the newer people on the call at some point exactly what that is. Okay.
And informational. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Gregory Wawro. And Dr. Wawro specializes in American politics and political methodology at Columbia University. He is the author of Legislative Entrepreneurship in the U.S. House of Representatives and co-author of Filibuster, Obstruction, and Lawmaking in the United States Senate, which is an historic analysis of the causes and consequences of filibusters. That's rather timely. Dr. Wawro, we're looking forward to hearing from you. And so the floor is all yours.
Thank you. First, I'd like to express my thanks for including me in the discussion today. We are currently confronting serious threats to American democracy, and many of those threats are taking the form of obscure procedural changes that many citizens will never know about, but could have profound consequences for political outcomes in the United States and then on their everyday lives. I think having an open discussion such as this is an important yet massively underappreciated component of a healthy democracy. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all and engage in this conversation. So I'll just give you an overall impression of when I read the document. It struck me as a reasonable and balanced way to approach some important issues in the nominating process. But that said, I'm an academic, and so it's my nature to pose questions that challenge our thinking about ideas and ways of working and might propel deeper contemplation. So there's a long tradition in the United States of seeking to compromise over representation. That's worked to keep the country unified through difficult periods with heterogeneous interests. But it's often come at severe cost to certain groups. And I think it's important to keep in mind that as we contemplate major reforms to the nomination process. And I think that speaks to some of the comments that Dr. Brown shared with us. The effort that is being considered here faces the ubiquitous problem in democratic institutions. That is, how do you balance representation with action? That is, if you increase representation, expand voices in the conversation, it makes it difficult to make decisions and take actions. So it's a very hard problem to solve. But again, this strikes me as a reasonable approach. One of the things that I was most struck by the proposal is when considering expanding the number of states who could move early in the primary process or the caucus process, this mixture or considering the mixture of urban and rural voters in a state seems really crucial to issues that we're facing in American politics today. And I think it speaks to a question about how the Democratic Party can improve outreach to rural voters, to signal to them that they are an important part of the party and that their interests will be taken into account in critical party decisions, such as who will be the nominee of the party for the presidency. There is a stark rural-urban divide that has emerged, or I should say has reemerged in the country. We haven't seen this kind of stark divide, this kind of pattern in voting behavior pretty much since the 19th century. And I would argue that that making this a centerpiece of the consideration, that is, how do you include both representation of a good mixture of representation of urban and rural voters, is a potentially important mechanism for addressing the what has happened in terms of rural areas moving much more into the Republican column. Another part of this question about considering which states would be permitted to go early is this question of economic diversity. That's one of the criteria that's being contemplated. And I would encourage the RBC to provide more clarity on what is meant by economic diversity. Are we talking about income distribution? Are we talking about types of industry? In my view, economic inequality is at the root of many of the problems that the United States currently faces. There's a lot of evidence that income inequality is a key driver of partisan polarization, that is polarization between the two parties, but we don't know much about how this could be potentially important to understanding how income inequality might impact internal party dynamics. But given what appears to be profound effects on overall dynamics in American politics, I think this is a really important consideration to pay attention to. Another question I had is thinking forward, what adjustments to procedures might be necessary as the competitive landscape changes? So competitiveness is a key criterion that's being considered, but if you look, it seems like the competitive landscape is actually undergoing changes that I wasn't sure I would see in my lifetime. So for example, Florida seems like it is heading in a less competitive direction, where through most of the time that I've been politically attentive, it's been either a Democratic state or a purple state. Georgia seems to be becoming much more competitive, not something I thought I would see in my lifetime, but it raises questions about how that landscape might change and what implications that would have for which states might be permitted. There's something in political science we like to talk about as path dependency. That is, once you make a decision, it sometimes forecloses options in the future. And so, if states are permitted to go earlier in the primary process, how hard would that be to undo? Especially if states that that fit the competitiveness criterion no longer fit that category. Another question that struck me as I was reading through the proposal and thinking about it was what other reforms might be considered in tandem with the current proposal to increase voter participation? This is not something that I'm necessarily saying should be considered as part of what we're talking about today. But it seems to me like this creates an opportunity to think more broadly about how voter participation might be increased. For example, doing something that's similar or expanding something that's similar to what has happened with the general election. That is, expanding the number of days to vote, expanding the options with regard to mail-in ballots. I view it as important to send the strongest signals possible that the Democratic Party is for robust voting rights and for broad participation, because that stands in stark contrast to what the Republican Party is standing for at the moment. My last question has to do with how changing the primary dates for certain states might affect other races. So Dr. Brown, I thought, spoke very eloquently about what happens at the non-presidential level, and we know that we have to nominate candidates for the House and for the Senate, and we also have to nominate candidates for down ballot races. And so I'm wondering if states change their primary dates for the presidential election, what sort of spillover effects there might be for other kinds of nominating processes. So, for example, if there are long lags in between the date when you vote for president and the date when you might vote for the nomination for the House or the Senate, would that decrease turnout? There is some concern about election fatigue. That is, one explanation that has appeared in the political science literature about why voter turnout in the United States is so low relative to other advanced democracies is that we have so many darn elections. We have elections at the federal level, we have elections at the state level, we have elections at the local level. And often these elections are held on different dates. And so voters don't bother to turn out because they just participated in an election a few months before, maybe the year before, and they just don't have the time to, or don't think they have the time, or they're just fatigued from having participated in those other elections. So those are the set of questions that were provoked by reading through the proposal and trying to think about what the committee is considering. I hope you find those questions helpful, and I'd be happy to elaborate on any of them or answer any questions that you might have for me.
Thank you so much, Doctor. These were really great points, and I think you've hit on a lot of areas where the committee has studied for a very long time. And thank you for really bringing this presentation forward and bringing it to life, quite frankly. With that, we'll see if we have any questions for you. And Veronica, do you see any questions in the queue?
I see no questions.
Wait a minute.
I see Frank Leone, he has a question. I'm used to seeing my students raise their hands, so I'm very sensitive to this.
Wow, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you. May I proceed, Madam Chair? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ware. I wanted to just point out that last time in our delegate selection rules, the Rules and Bylaws Committee added Rule 2I, which requires each state party to talk about in their delegate selection plan what they are doing to increase participation and recommends easier voting and absentee voting and all those sorts of processes. This year, I think we might want to take a look at that and see if there are any minor changes we might want to make to address the election security and election subversion issues that you started talking about. So if you have at some point any thoughts on that, we'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation. I'm not familiar with all the different rules and regulations at the state level, but I think that having centralized encouragement for expanding voter rights. I mean, states. One thing we know: the states have very different traditions about voter participation, and some very states we might think are very progressive today do not necessarily have very progressive traditions when it comes to maintaining your registration status, being able to participate in primaries, and so any sort of encouragement from the central party leadership about how to make that happen more uniformly across the states, I think would be a welcome addition.
Veronica, thank you so much. Veronica, did you see any more questions?
No, we have no additional hands.
Well, I'll turn it back over to Jim.
Thanks very much, Mignon. Our next speaker is Tylik McMillan. And Mr. McMillan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Tylik.
Tylik, okay. Tylik is a recent graduate of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. Since the age of 13, under the leadership of Reverend Al Sharpton, Tylik has served as the Southeastern Regional Youth Director, current Washington, D.C. Bureau Policy Advisor, and National Director of Youth and College of the National Action Network, which is one of the nation's leading civil rights organizations working in the spirit and tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to promote the modern civil rights agenda. I'm looking forward to what Tylik has to share with this committee. Tylik, would you please take the floor?
Yes, of course. I want to thank Chairwoman Moore, the entire DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee for the invitation, and all of the DNC staff in their respective places. And lastly, Chairman Jaime Harrison for his voice and leadership thus far. I would like to start off by setting the table setting the table that soaring turnout and big margins among young voters were central to the Democrats' victories in the 2018 congressional and 2020 presidential elections. But with many young people expressing their disenchantment with Democrats' performance, preserving these advantages glooms as one of the biggest challenges facing Democrats in the 2022 midterm and 2024 presidential election. There's a widespread concern amongst Democrats that turnout for young people this November and in 2024 could fall back from its gains. And I make it clear to this committee and broadly that youth turnout could save or sink Democrats in 2022. And being a proud alum, as you mentioned, of North Carolina A&T State University, our nation's largest and public HBCU, I cannot stress the importance of HBCU's voting power in the 2024 presidential election. This generation of young Black voters will be pivotal in the quest for turnout and engagement. The truth in the fact is that students at historically Black colleges and universities are a pivotal demographic when it comes to voting. The political power of our students displays in nearly every major election, and with midterms quickly approaching, this year will be no different. Our campus continues to be a force and a deciding factor of whether candidates win or lose, which is what we see in how HBCUs have constantly been under attack when it comes to redistricting and racial gerrymandering. In fact, many of our campuses are the biggest voting bloc in many of the towns that we come from. To point out, there is a large portion of HBCUs in the South. Then it also provides an opportunity for our campuses to engage with presidential campaigns, but it's an opportunity to pull in an important block of voters to a very crucial election and for a crucial progression of our country. And I believe that the investment and commitments must begin early. And though it may not be a metric of the application, it should be something that members of this committee should think wholeheartedly about. Our students and our HBCUs want our needs to be addressed, and our students' needs to be addressed consistently. And we expect constant engagement, and not only during the times that matter. We have seen now and have been accustomed to a new level of exposure, and I believe that we should keep that same momentum. The 2016 and 2020 presidential election demonstrated that young Black voters at our historically Black colleges and universities and turnout and organizing helped shape our politics and our society. And I just wanted to flag that to the committee of the importance of engaging with historically Black colleges and universities, because that is an important sector of voting in our country. And not to mention, we are on many campuses in the South, and it's just a way to engage to help get out that young Black vote. And I want to thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. And thank you all for your leadership.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. Those are very insightful and helpful comments and things that we will definitely need to keep in mind and will keep in mind during our process. Do any RBC members have a question for Tylik?
Sure, David McDonald does.
Very much for your comments. I take your point that we need to consistently engage, not just once every 4 years, but consistently engage. I'd be interested in your thoughts about the other side of that equation. We want to, in the first instance, get people to vote who have not voted in the past. But the second part of that equation is getting them to vote consistently. And so as we try to improve our consistent engagement, do you have any suggestions for the ways in which we consistently engage to get these new voters into local elections and turning them into regular voters who vote the Democratic line as frequently as possible? Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much for that question, Mr. McDonald. I would say the engagement happening, as you said, not only every 4 years, but how can our communication, even at the local level, whether it's the state party leaders engaging with our campuses to hear the concerns of our students and what they're asking for from the party. I think a lot of times we see candidates come onto our campuses and just expect a vote and expect voters to turn out. But I think engagement on a yearly basis, or if not, consistent communication with them, whether it's roundtables with HBCU leaders, whether it's roundtables with HBCU presidents, roundtables with HBCU SGA presidents, and is a way to engage with the student body. When we think about, getting these new voters engaged, as I said before, a lot of our students come from marginalized communities, whether it's, we look at gerrymandered campuses. I remember when I was a student on ANT's campus, we were split between 2 congressional districts. And if we moved across campus, we had to re-register all over again. And so that it gets this hectic, process within it. And I think if we educate our students and engage with them on a regular basis, and it doesn't have to be the national level, it could be on the state party level. That could be a way of getting folks more in the know and getting them more excited when it comes to voter turnout.
Veronica, do we have any other questions?
I'm not seeing any hands, no, and we have Craig Smith next.
Okay, thank you very much once again, Mr. McMillan. Very useful. And I will turn it back to Co-Chair Moore now.
Thank you again, Tylik. So this is an honor and a privilege for me to introduce one of my former mentors and the person that actually got me involved in Democratic politics besides David Wilhelm, and that's Craig Smith. Craig Smith is a prominent Democratic Party political strategist. He served as White House political director during the Clinton administration. He was the first hire of President Bill Clinton's successful campaign during the 1992 election. He served as senior advisor for Ready for Hillary in 2013 and 14, and later served as a senior advisor for Hillary for America. In addition to his work for the Clintons, Smith has worked on many political campaigns, including as campaign director and senior advisor for Joe Lieberman in 2004, in his 2004 presidential campaign, and campaign manager for Al Gore in his 2000 presidential campaign. Smith's alma mater is the University of Arkansas, where he earned his BS in public administration in 1980 and graduated from the School of Law in 1982. Please help me welcome our friend to the floor, Craig Smith, and it is so good to see you again, Craig.
I appreciate that warm introduction, and congratulations on your appointment. Is a very smart move by the chair. As Mignon outlined, I've worked in a leadership position in 7 of the last 9 Democratic presidential campaigns. And each time I'm kind of a numbers guy, so I end up doing a lot of the numbers, and the nominating process is something I'm pretty familiar with and spend a lot of time working on. But being a numbers guy, we have to look and see if the system we have works. Since we've adopted this system, beginning in 1976, we've had 12 presidential elections. 4 times we've had an incumbent president or incumbent vice president run. So as always, we don't turn out people who win, and those people won the nomination. But 8 times we've had what I call a jump ball situation. Now, in those 8 times, once our nominee has won both Iowa and New Hampshire. 5 times our nominee has won either Iowa or New Hampshire, and twice our nominee didn't win either. So 75% of the time, winning Iowa or New Hampshire was critical to winning our nomination. Iowa and New Hampshire combined make up about 1.5% of our population. But 75% of our nominees come out of that system, and it's because they're first. Now, I don't think I have to spend a lot of time convincing people that who goes first is important. You know, in 2020, 27 candidates ran for the Democratic nomination. 20 of them dropped out by the time New Hampshire was over. I mean, these states are hugely important. Somebody's got to go first. The question is, are these two states, Iowa and New Hampshire, that go first, are they the right two states to start with? And I think if you look at the numbers don't indicate that they are. And here's why. 6 of our nominees have won either Iowa or New Hampshire, or both. 2 of them went on to become president. So that's 33% of the time that system gave us a president. Okay, we're basically a two-party country. You could flip a coin and get 50-50. So it's not serving us well. Now, twice we had nominees who won neither Iowa and New Hampshire. Both of those nominees answer to Mr. President. So we have a system that is set up to produce nominees, and it does well doing that, Iowa and New Hampshire, but it doesn't produce a lot of presidents. You know, so, and why is that? I got 2 theories on that. First is there's a regional bias here. 8 Iowa caucuses have happened under this system where we didn't have an incumbent. 6 times a candidate from Iowa or a state that bordered Iowa ran. 4 times that candidate won. So there is a regional bias. You know, 4 times out of 8, somebody who lived in Iowa or next to it won the Iowa caucuses. Now, if you go to New Hampshire, and the New Hampshire situation is similar, but even worse. 8 times we've had New Hampshire primaries. 5 times candidates from a neighboring state ran in New Hampshire. 5 times they won. Now, if you look at Iowa, New Hampshire, and the states that border them, it makes up about 12% of the country. But it's producing 50% of our nominees. So is it realistic to assume that the American public wants their nominees to come from 12% of the country half the time? Well, we know that's not true. Those states that border Iowa and New Hampshire produce 1 president out of 8. So the American public wants them to get elected 12% of the time. But we're making 50% of our nominees. Our system is designed that 50% of our nominees come from there because of so much importance on the early states. So the regional bias almost doesn't ensure, but it is highly likely, or at least 50% of the time, we'll get a nominee from a state that borders Iowa or New Hampshire. The second reason that they're not a good gauge is because demographically they don't look like America. I've been a pollster, and I know to predict what a large group is going to do through polling, you have to have a sample that is reflective of the larger group. Okay. We have 5 states in this country that are more than 90% white. One of them is Iowa. One of them is New Hampshire. Using Iowa and New Hampshire to predict, as a predictor of who Democrats should nominate that can win, not going to be accurate because we know there are racial voting patterns. And we know those 2 states won't reflect those in the system. But because 75% of the time they pick our nominee, we have a system that is good at generating nominees, but not so good at generating presidents. Now, what would I do about it? I would do a couple of things. I like the idea of starting with a small state. It gives underfunded candidates an opportunity to break through and become president. I think that's important. But I think it is important if you're going to have early states that have so much impact on our nominee, it's important to make sure that those early states are reflective of the whole country, because at the end of the day, to get a president, we got to have somebody who can win in the whole country. So I don't think you can find a single small state that is representative of the country. And I think you should consider having multiple small states go first. You know, and the combination of those small states could reflect the national electorate, but the current 2 states we use don't. So I would have more than one small state go at a time to see if we can get something that looks more representative of the country. The second thing I would do is, because this system seems to have a regional bias, the idea of rotating those early states would seem to make a lot of sense. Half of our nominees come from 12% of the country, okay? Only 12% of our presidents do. We need to have a system that produces a wider area of nominees if we want to win the general election. So the idea of rotating the first states, so the same state doesn't go over and over again. Here's an additional problem of using the same two states over and over. Candidates all know what's going to go first and second. Interest groups do too. They have spent millions of dollars in Iowa and New Hampshire educating voters about issues. The voters of Iowa and New Hampshire are more educated on the issues, they're more organized, they're more mobilized because of all this attention they get. Now, I wish all voters in America were like voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, but the reality is they're not. You know, the voters of Iowa and New Hampshire aren't reflective of the general election or the general electorate. So those are the two changes I would make. I would have more than one small state go first, and I would rotate them around so we don't end up with a regional bias that keeps producing nominees from the same region when we know the American people don't like to elect presidents from the same region that often. So those are my suggestions to the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come before you today, and if anybody's got any questions, I'll take them.
Craig, as always, you are always thinking politically and strategically. So thank you so much for that. I see that we have a hand raised with Frank. Frank, the floor is yours.
Hey, Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Thank you for your comments and your observations. Regarding your first proposal, having a grouping of smaller states go first, to tease that out a little. So you might have the first primary date, 2 or 3 states, and then 2 weeks later, 2 or 3 states, and then the regular window starting. This is a question that's comes up with every kind of a reform proposal. But do you have any thoughts on how to convince states like New Hampshire to share their primary dates, and so your plan could be implemented?
Well, I know what we've done in the past. If it was up to me, and I'm speaking for a day, I would do 2 or 3 small states on one day. 2 weeks later, I do 2 medium-sized states. 2 weeks later, I do 1 large state, and then open the window. But every region would have to have one of those. You've got to have each region of the country represented. And if you're going to do 5, one region is going to get 2, and that's going to be kind of a random. How do you convince them? I remember 2008 when Hillary ran, and Florida went early. I think it was 2008. May have been whenever it was. Florida went early, and the DNC was very clear to Florida, you will get no delegates at the convention. Now, is that penalty enough to move a state like Iowa or New Hampshire, who this process is a big part of their state's economy? I don't know, maybe not. But it is the only tool we have. And, if we come up with a new system, states have to comply with it, and we need to have penalties for those who don't. What those penalties are, your committee probably has more experience with what those could be than mine. I was on the receiving end from Florida, and we didn't like it. I'm sure nobody else would either. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Anybody else? David?
Yeah, I see a hand for David McDonald.
Yes. Hi, Craig. Your comments about the regional bias and the low percentage, the candidates who've run from adjacent states leads me to ask, what states in the country have produced the most presidents? And are you indirectly advocating that we ought to make our front states be those states that have produced the most presidents in the past, or should we be trying to move the needle in some other fashion?
No, I don't think you can use the past as an indicator, because one analysis that I had done for me when I think I was in the White House is the nominee who lives closest to the population center of the United States is more likely to win than the nominee who lives further away from that population center. As this country has evolved, the population center of the country has moved. It started out to be in Virginia, and Virginia elected a lot of presidents. Then it moved to Kentucky and Ohio, and then Ohio elected a lot of presidents. Okay, it continues to move west and south, and now I think it's like somewhere near Springfield, Missouri. Does that mean we have to go to Springfield, Missouri? No, but I don't think you can go too far back to say Ohio's elected 8, so we need to be next to Ohio, because Ohio elected 8 when Ohio was the population center of the country, and it's not anymore. So I don't think you want to get stuck on that. But I think having multiple states gives you, if there is going to be a regional bias, you will have multiple regional biases that will offset each other. And at the end result will be a more, as long as there is diversity in these early states, you will have a more representative sample of what Democrats in this country want in their presidential nominee, which is more likely to produce a nominee who can get elected president. I believe that. Others may not.
David, does that answer your question? I am assuming it does. Veronica, do we have any more questions for Craig?
I see no additional hands.
Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I am honored and proud of both what you've done and what this committee is doing, and anything else I can do to be helpful to you all, just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Craig. It is indeed my honor to now introduce probably a woman who really needs no introduction, because she has been a fierce fighter for everything this party stands for, what's right, what's just. And she's been fighting on the front lines for many, many years. Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter represents House District 66 in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, which I've had the privilege of visiting. She is the first African-American woman elected to the State House from Orangeburg County. Previously a teacher and an instructor, she still is teaching and instructing us all. She also worked as a caseworker for Orangeburg Department of Social Services and currently works as a social worker administrator. She is the immediate past president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators and has served as chair of the DNC's Regional Caucus, the first woman of color ever to be elected to that position. Representative Cobb, it is good to see you.
Thank you so much, man.
Bring it on, because I know you are.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and to the other members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come before you to talk about the South and the DNC and the early primaries and all of that. And Madam Chair, I'm not sure how much I'm going to bring it on. Going to be able to bring it on, because it's been a long week in the South Carolina legislature. And for those of you who follow legislatures, particularly those in the South, can probably appreciate the point that I am trying to make. But just a couple of things, if I may. I appreciate the previous speaker and the notion of rotating primaries. I like the idea of that. But I want to speak in my capacity as former DNC Southern Caucus Chair, as well as immediate past president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, because most of the Black legislators across the country reside in the Southern region. And so I am here to speak in favor of Southern primaries, early primaries. I particularly want to go on record saying that the South Carolina primary, I think, is a good idea and one that I am hopeful that this committee will keep. The reason that I believe South Carolina is a great idea is because we are a small state, we are a diverse state, We're small enough so that lesser known candidates with limited resources can come into South Carolina and make their case with voters up close and personal, retail politics in a way that other states don't. And while traditionally South Carolina has been thought of as majority Black, I think it's important for the committee to recognize that South Carolina, like most of the states in the South, South Carolina, I think, is number 5 as far as the fastest growing Latino population in the country. So we are diverse, not just from the standpoint of African American, but we have a growing Hispanic population, as well as a Pacific Asian population around certain centers in this state. And so for those reasons, I think when we talk about diversity, when we talk about candidates appealing to people who really do look like America, South Carolina offers that. The added plus here, in my view, is the number of historically Black colleges and universities that we have here in South Carolina. The opportunity to grow our political pool, grow our troops, if you will, by having presidential candidates come into this state, visit HBCU campuses, and I am a firm believer that that kind of interaction is what we need to do more of to grow our political future, if you will. And while I am very pro on South Carolina, I think it would help our presidential nominee if we also looked at doing another early primary in a larger southern state, to the west, if you will. I think if we kept South Carolina, looked at adding a state with the same kinds of things that we have here in South Carolina, but to a larger degree from a diversity standpoint, I believe those two together would give us a real clear indicator of how our nominee will fare across the country. I am not going to belabor the point. I think I've made pretty much the most salient points that I wanted to. I'll close my comments, Madam Chair, by suggesting to you that I want to pick up on the point about how informed voters are in Iowa and New Hampshire. And I would charge this committee with coming up, and there are a bunch of brilliant minds on here, far more so than I am, but I think we have got to not separate the voter education piece from whatever early primaries or whatever states are chosen. And my point is, we talk all the time about exciting voters and getting voters to be interested. And I have reflected on the number of years I spent as Southern Caucus chair and how we worked tirelessly in the Southern Caucus to get the rest of the DNC to pay attention to the South. We knew years ago, more than 20 years ago, that the South was a growing region and that we would fall very close to becoming a party made up of the West Coast and the East Coast with all of this wilderness in between. And so I'm not willing to concede the South. I am hopeful that the DNC and all of the other affiliated groups recognize the opportunity that the South offers to this party. But Madam Chair, I would just caution you and the other committees to understand that that is something that the potential, I shall say, is not something that will be reached if we cycle around every 4 years, mainly in the fall, trying to get people excited. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions for me.
Thank you so much for that, Rep. So are there any questions?
It was not that profound, but thanks anyway.
No, but it was very poignant. So that's probably why there are no questions. You were very clear.
I try to be, Madam Chair. Thank you all so much for the work that you're doing. Much appreciated.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Jim for our next guest.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you, Mignon. Thank you both. I have the real honor of introducing our next speaker. The Reverend Dr. William Barber is the President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, Bishop with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, and pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina. I had the privilege of seeing and hearing Bishop Barber receive the Four Freedoms Award of the Roosevelt Institute. So I know that we are in for a special message here, and I'd like to turn it over to Bishop Barber.
Well, thank you so much, my friends, as I gather here today. And, you know, you remind me that I received that award the same night that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did. And I never will forget sitting with her and couldn't talk to her because we had a case before the court, but I at least got the chance to sit beside her. You know, I've listened to the speakers all today, and for these few minutes that I'm with you, I want to jump right in and suggest that we are in the midst of a crisis of civilization and a crisis of democracy. We're in a reconstruction moment that could go either way. And we have to talk about it like that. A lot of what we've seen before. If you know the history of Reconstruction in this country, the first Reconstruction, 1868 to 1898, the second Reconstruction from 1954 to 1968. And all of those reconstructions were violently ended and disrupted. And at the last one in 1968, a plan was put in place as a book called The Time of Illusion that was written about a plan that was put in by extremists who call themselves Republican. By the way, I'm not here as Democrat or Republican today, I'm an independent. But they wrote that in order to control the country, they had to engage in positive polarization. Dent, Kevin Phillips, and Buchanan went to Richard Nixon and said, we have to do positive polarization. We must divide the country, and we must disavow it when it's found out. But we must divide the country, and especially the South, because we can't hold it unless we divide it, because what Dr. King said could happen. Poor and low wealth white people and Black people could come together and form a political voting bloc that would fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the nation. And so what we see today has been over 40 years in the making. This plan, some people call it the Southern strategy, but it wasn't just a strategy for the South. If you read the history on it, it was a strategy for the whole nation, born in the South, but that would intentionally use division. Now, part of what happened is Democrats, many, played into it by siloing our work, because that was part of the division that the extremists wanted. They wanted everybody to be siloed in the work. And the second goal was to stop any conversation about poor and low wealth people politically. So for the last 50 years, even in Democratic politics, the language about the poor and low wealth has literally gone silent. Check it out. When's the last time you have seen one presidential election that had one 30-minute debate on how you address poverty and low wealth in this country? The way the government measures poverty distorts the truth, tells us it's only 39 million people because the numbers say that you're not poor if you make $12,800 a year as a single person. We started coming up with things on the Republican side. They would say things like the poor is a moral issue, people's personal failure. Democrats stopped saying the word poor and low wealth and started saying those trying to make it into the middle class. And we've written that off and played into the division. And in this moment, I want to suggest strongly that we have to have a restoration of a reconstruction attitude about where we are. And we're going to have to address 5 interlocking injustices simultaneously. systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism coupled with white supremacy. And those 5 interlocking injustices and evils are the things that we must address, and we can't silo them. One group over here, Black folk over here, white people over here, brown people over here. We have to address them because all 5 of them have been used. And inside of the one on denial of healthcare is the denial of women's rights. That if they've been used to divide us, so much so that too often what we see, and even in activism, people get upset about their issue and don't understand the intersection. Take, for instance, right now, people move to the street, and rightfully so, over what potentially the Supreme Court will do to women's rights. I'm headed to the street. That's been on this morning. But I was talking to some of my friends, Planned Parenthood and others, and said, but wait a minute. Where was this same intensity when Manchin and 49 Republicans blocked living wages that also hurt women and hurt Black folk and brown folk? Or when they blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act? Because how do people get in office and on the court to roll back laws through the political process? We cannot silo our righteous indignation. We cannot silo our moral outcry. We cannot silo our street activism, push to the polls, and our political debate. We must have, in this moment, a moral fusion coming together. That's why on June 18th, 2022, we're more than 42 state coordinating committees, 2,500 clergy, over 20 religious bodies, and 147 partners, led by poor and low wealth people, are having a mass poor people's low wage workers assembly, moral march on Washington and to the polls, where poor and low wealth people will take the stage, not people speaking on their behalf, but poor and low wealth people will take the stage. I'm going to say some very truthful things because I want you all to hear it today. You know, for 3 months, for 8 months, actually more than 8 months now, religious leaders have been asking the White House to sit with poor and low wealth people from West Virginia, from the Appalachia to Alabama, religious leaders and economists, over a year. And that has not happened. What does that say about how we really care about poor and low wealth people? You say, well, Reverend Barber, it's such a small group. Well, let me give you some numbers. People run for elections, right, to put policies in place. That's what you're supposed to or to protect rights and to spend resources. Politicians run to implement policies, and parties push those politics and hopefully push those politics to deal with things like establishing justice and providing for the common good and promoting the general welfare and equal protection under the law, and using those grand principles as an overlay and a guide for the kind of policies we put in place. Well, right now, as we're on this call tonight, even before the pandemic, 250,000 people died a year from poverty, according to Columbia University, 700 people a day. Where's the outcry been within party? 140 million people are in poverty and low wealth right now before the pandemic. That's 42% of the country living in poverty and low wealth. That's 52% of our children. That's 39 million children. That's 21 million elders. That's 74 million women. That's 65 million men. That's 23 million Black people. That's 38 million Latino people. That's 8 million Asian people. That's 2 million Native people and 66 million white people. And 1/3 of all the people in the South, evenly split almost between Black and white. And yet, when is the last time you have heard a major senatorial candidate or congressional candidate or presidential candidate among Democrats even say the word poverty consistently and how their particular policies are going to address the poor? Pandemic relief programs like stimulus checks and all those things, child tax credit that are ending. But now we know that if those policies had not been put in place, the poverty level would have risen to over 150 million people. Nearly over 50% of our population in poverty. Right now, almost 43% of our population in poverty. How do you write off that many people and not be consistently dealing with how your policies are going to address that? We have in the midst of this pandemic, 84% of all the COVID relief money went to corporations. Billionaires made $2 trillion in the first 15 months, while 8 million more people fell into poverty. We gave corporations trillions of dollars, but could not find a way to do 1.9 trillion over 10 years when the Economic Policy Institute says we actually need 10 trillion, a trillion a year for the next 10 years to just have some recovery and real recovery from the bottom up. And that's not, we don't have a lack of scarcity because our gross domestic product is over $22 trillion. But if we're not even talking about the poor, we're not even talking about it, we're not putting it on the campaign trails, then how can you move people? 52 million people right now are working for less than a living wage of $15 an hour. 2 Democrats and 49 Republicans voted to take $15 an hour out of the American Rescue Plan. We had 1 vote and that's it. Why are we not constantly bringing that back up? I was asked by a prominent Democrat if in our poor people's campaign movement, if we would talk about voting rights and not talk about living wages in the same breath. That's the kind of a nonsensical political conversation that doesn't move people. 47% of Black workers make less than $15 an hour. And we're not talking about that in terms of trying to move Black folk to the polls. 46% of Latinos, 26% of white workers, 40% of women, and half of working women making less than $15 are women of color. If you're going to move people, you don't just move them by visiting them and coming. People said candidates need to go visit people. No, they don't. Because if you just visit people without policies that meet their need, they don't even pay attention to you. You have to visit them and then talk about them openly and how electing you is going to put policies in place that will impact their lives. Here we are, before the pandemic, we had 8 to 11 million people who were homeless or on the risk of becoming homeless. And now 11 million people are at risk of losing their home as moratoriums are ceasing. We cannot have a politics or political campaigns, Senate campaign, presidential campaign, congressional campaign, state legislature, that are not raising these issues. And it's got to be raised in every state. Before the pandemic, 14 million households could not afford water. Now with moratoriums ending 218 million, or 67% of US population, are vulnerable to losing their access to water. We cannot leave these issues undealt with, because if we do, we're not speaking the language of the people, because the language of the people is what's on the people's mind. Now, somebody says, yeah, Reverend Barber, poor people don't really vote. Well, that's not true. We did a study called Awaken the Sleeping Giant with Columbia University and asked the question, why don't poor people vote? The number one answer was not suppression. It was nobody talks to us. Nobody visits us. When I was up in Harlan County in the Appalachia or down in the Delta, that's what people say. The fact of the matter is poor people now represent 32% of the electorate. So if you're not talking to poor people, you're basically saying a third of the electorate doesn't even matter. And in battleground states, poor and low wealth people represent 45% of the electorate. 45% of the electorate. In 15 states, take a look at our study. The number of, if you just move from 1 to 22% of poor and low wealth people who are already registered to vote, in Michigan is 1%. In Georgia is 7%, in Florida is 4%, in North Carolina is 19%. Of poor and low wealth people who are already registered to vote, who did not vote because they weren't moved. If just 19% of them would move in North Carolina and we went after them, they could change who sits in the governor's office, in the Senate offices, and in the Oval Office. 1% in Michigan, 7% in Georgia, 4% in Florida. And the numbers are startling when you look at how small they are. Not 30%, not 40%, but if we're not even talking to people, We talk about who got President Biden and Kamala Harris elected to the presidency. You know the number we have not talked about? 55% of poor and low-wealth people that make less than $50,000. And that's without having a major number of them moved. That's 55% of poor and low-wealth people. That's the sleeping giant. That's the stone that the builders have rejected. That any party that's not seriously dealing with poor and low-wealth people and fighting for policies that would transform their lives, that would make a difference, is not serious about long-term holding of office. Can't be serious, because basically what you're saying is a third of the people don't matter. And then lastly, we've got to stop talking about things like voting rights as Black issues only. You know, we keep saying the current attack on voter suppression is Jim Crow 2. No, it's not Jim Crow 2. It's not even Jim Crow. This is James Crow Esquire. Because when you look at the data, the states that have passed all these voter suppression laws, it will affect 55 million voters, not just Black voters. This is an attempt to shut down the progressive potential in this country. It may be targeted at Black people, but it's not limited. Women will be hurt. Young folk, students are hurt. Poor white folk are hurt. Working folk. And we need to talk about, if you go back to the civil rights movement, Dr. King and others, they always talked about the voting rights as a threat to the entire democracy, not just Black people. And we need to recover and recapture that. Every time we're talking about voting rights, we need to have a diverse group of people standing there. We need to talk about how suppression to voting rights suppresses all of us, and it suppresses living wages, it suppresses healthcare, it suppresses who sits on the Supreme Court. So that what folk understand is voting rights is not a special interest of Black people. It may be targeted at Black people, but it is not just the special interest of Black people. In fact, we also got to do some repenting, because Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013 when President Obama was president. We filed our first case 47 minutes after it was gutted in North Carolina. Some people say North Carolina, we lost the legislature. The Democrats lost the legislature to a supermajority, extremist majority in 2012. Actually, they didn't. Go back and look at the numbers. There were more people that voted progressive, but the gerrymandering is what caused it. But the gerrymandering was challenged under the Holder administration. The Holder Justice Department approved the gerrymandering plan in North Carolina that we took to court and proved it was racist. How did it get through? And then later on be proved as racist 7 years later. Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. And there was no major candidate, Senate or otherwise, that took up voting rights and restoring the Voting Rights Act in the party as a major issue. All of a sudden, when Trump does it, now it's a major issue. It was a major issue, period, from 2013. We cannot isolate our moral outrage, and we must connect these issues. We must connect, like Dr. King did, voting rights to economic justice, voting rights to women's rights, voting rights to all of them, and not just as Black issues, as I have said. And then we must make sure that we are reaching out. If we are serious in this country, and particularly Democrats, if we are serious, if you are serious about meeting this third Reconstruction moment, this crisis of civilization, you cannot, in your language, in your campaigning, in your policy proposal, I'm talking about candidates, write off a third of the electorate. I was told on camera, we were told when Pete Buttigieg came to our church, I asked him directly, why is it that candidates didn't talk about poverty? He looked into the camera and said he was going to get in trouble for saying it, but it needed to be said. He said the political advisors to the party tell candidates not to talk about poverty. You go check it out. I got it on camera. We asked every presidential candidate in the last election to make sure there was one debate on poverty, where the candidates had to deal with the issues affecting the poor. Every one of them said it needed to happen, and that they would say to the party structure, it needs to happen, and it did not. The only time poverty was mentioned forthright, it was in Iowa, when we were outside in 19 below degree weather. And it was brought up twice by two of the candidates running. We cannot have a politics of the middle class and the wealthy. And in the South, where I live, the South is not red. The South is unorganized. The South is uninvested in. The South is where we are not working to pull together that contingency, that group that Martin King mentioned that said, if just a group of them, a remnant of them would come together, black and white, poor people, the masses, they could fundamentally shift the political power and the economic power structure in this country. Neoliberal Reagan Democrats committed to moderate ideas only undermine the ability of us to speak to all people. The only hope, and I know we're going to do it because we want to see this country establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare and ensure equal protection under the law. Fusion organizing and resisting silos that include lifting from the bottom up is the only key. That's how the abolitionists beat the slave masters. That's how the civil rights movement beat. That's how the early union movement took on the monopolies of business. That's what works. That's what works. And so we've got to build this movement. Parties can't do it. We have to do it in the streets. We have to work hard at it. I told one Democratic congressperson some years ago who actually was willing to propose that the Voting Rights Act be restored without covering but two states, Texas and Georgia. That's unacceptable. And we've said in recent days that if we are serious, we can't have one vote on voting rights and then fold our hands and say we lost, or one vote on living wages. We got to keep on, because sometimes the people don't need to know you want it. They need to know you won't stop fighting for it. And then you let them know, if you want us to win this, then go to the polls in masses and give us the power to do it. But what you can't do is have a vote and quit and say, oh, well. No, what you have to do is fight, fight, fight. And moderation is not the language. One of the great white abolitionists said, go tell a woman whose child is burning up in a house to be moderate in their cries, but don't dare tell me to be moderate in the face of the evils of slavery. He wasn't saying that you ought to be moderate for the child burning. He was trying to drive home a point. And in this moment, this third Reconstruction moment, we've got serious, serious work to do. So if we're serious about this, the Poor People's Campaign has put out 14 policies, for goals and visions for the healing of this democracy. One, we got to center and prioritize the 140 million poor, low-income people in this nation. If we don't do that, we'll be beat all the time. Two, we've got to secure a right to adequate standard of living and living wages and using the tax codes to lift up the poor. Third, we've got to secure the right to work with dignity. We've got to secure the right for health, secure the right for housing, secure the rights for food, water, broadband, public utilities, secure the right for education, secure the right to democracy and equal protection under the law, and voter not only protection, but expansion. Secure and enact comprehensive just immigration, secure the rights of indigenous people and First Nation peoples, enact a robust climate agenda that speaks to how it will impact people at the bottom, because if you lift the bottom, everybody rises. We've got to enact fair taxation on the ultra-rich and corporations, and we've got to prioritize peace, diplomacy, and nuclear non-proliferation, and we've got to repair social and economic injustices in this country and not allow the dispossessed to be unheard and unseen. And that's why on June 18th, we're gathering. Our motto is we need a moral meeting. We need a moral reset. We need to build power among poor and low wealth people. We need to promote a third Reconstruction, and we won't be unseen or unheard anymore. On June 18th, the people will not be people like me speaking on behalf of poor and low wealth people, but it will be white mamas from Appalachia standing on the stage with white mamas, black mamas from Alabama, and Latino mamas from California. It will be workers up in Binghamton, New York, who make less than a living wage, standing with workers from Mississippi who make less than a living wage. It will be people in Kentucky standing with people from South Carolina. It will be all of us, and the people who are impacted, poor and low wealth people, they will speak to this nation. They will put a face and a voice on the 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. They will demand the kind of agenda that could transform the country. And if we listen to them, and stop writing off and stop patronizing to poor people. The worst thing you can say when poor and low wealth people say, I'm not being heard, you say, well, I grew up poor too. No, that's not the point. The point is we cannot keep having political debates that write off a third of the electorate before we ever have an election. That is not a winning strategy for anybody, anywhere. And lastly, it doesn't line up with God. Because God said, if a nation is going to be a great nation, the question is going to be, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you see about me and make sure I had health care? When I was in prison, did you visit me? When I was an immigrant, did you welcome me? That is the formula. Always has been. Always is. And I pray with everything in me that the Democrat Party will not run from the poor any longer. Any longer. I don't care what color they are. But you will be the party that says the 140 million people in this country who are poor and low wealth have a voice and have fighters and are welcome in the party. And if we do that, we will shut down the Southern strategy and call forth and bring forth a third Reconstruction in this country. God bless you.
And I'm going to say amen. And I am going to thank you, Reverend Barber. You always lift us up, sometimes by dragging us through pretty bad reality. And this was a very powerful message, and I thank you for bringing it to us. Is there anyone who has questions for Reverend Barber?
I see a question from Donna, Jim.
Donna, please go ahead.
Let's see. Thank you, Jim. First of all, Reverend Barber, thank you so much for your great leadership, sir. I remember calling upon you in 2017 to come help the Democratic Party set the stage for the next cycle. You graciously accepted our invitation, and I'm so pleased that you have remained in contact with this party, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, sir. As you well know, Reverend Barber, I'm going to ask 2 questions. 2024 represents the 40th anniversary of Reverend Jesse Jackson's historic campaign that not only expanded the party, but challenged the party to open its doors to voters who had been previously denied their eligibility, coming off the 64 campaign with Fannie Lou Hamer, which I don't have to tell you the history. I'm down in Louisiana, so the history speaks to me even as I came home to welcome the Urban League here. So Reverend Barber, this party, which is represented by elected officials from the Vice President, President of the United States, to members of Congress, to governors, this party also have advocates and activists from the left and the middle. This party that has been a North Star in leading so many progressive campaigns to raise the minimum wage, to expand Medicaid for poor people, to ensure that every American have access to the basic humanitarian needs. We always come across this red river. A red river and this native South, sir, where we have a large percentage of those voters who are impoverished, a large percentage of those voters who are represented by members in Washington as well as in their state houses who are indifferent. Sir, how do we connect these dots? Many of these voters feel that while this crisis impacts them, this moral crisis to them is above their heads. They just want to survive. Mm-hmm. How do we connect this to their everyday lives as ordinary people talking to the masses who need to hear this message, who needs to understand that whether it's those elected leaders in DC or in their state capitals, if it's the advocates and the activists who are fighting to be their North Star, how do we connect the people who need this help to those who will be their voices once they're in power? And thank you, sir, for all your great leadership.
Well, thank you, my dear sister. It's always good to see you. And you were there in '84. I was there as a student working in the South with students in North Carolina, Black and white, who were part of that campaign. You know, what the Democratic Party has to be able to hear is loving criticism that's not a knock on what we have done, but a question on what have we done lately in terms of big things. So Medicaid 64. We have to be honest about some things we didn't do when we had majorities in both houses and in the presidency. We just have to be honest about that. It's not a knock. It's just, you got to be honest about that. We've got to be honest about living wage hadn't been raised for 12 years. And some of it is not whether it happened, it's whether we fought for it to happen. That's the issue. We've had to challenge Dems on 15 and the living wage. I understand challenging those who want to treat corporations like people and people like things. But, or take, for instance, what we had recently this year, when we had 2 senators vote against. You know, if people had ever thought about that, President Kamala Harris would have had a deciding vote on lifting 41% of Black people out of poverty and over 52 million Americans with 1 vote. And it was blocked by 49 Republicans and 2 Democrats. From states where, for instance, West Virginia, 710,000 people in that state are poor and low wealth, and 350,000 make less than the living wage. We have to go to those places as activists. We have to mobilize in those places. I can tell you, I can go into all of it, that some people were told to stand down and we can fix this in the back room. You've never had any major progress fixed in the back room if you don't have power in the front room opening up the back room. Yes, we run into a red river, but there's some data we got to look at. Poor and low wealth people don't vote against their own interests. That's not me just saying that. That's a proven data. I can show it to you. We did this study because we asked that same question. Because poor and low wealth get this bad rap. Most of them just don't vote, period. And the percentage that we need to touch to overcome the margins of victories, even in southern states, is not that high. 19% in North Carolina, 7% in Florida. Of poor and low wealth folk who are already registered, who didn't vote, that if we went hard after them, not just in terms of political rhetoric, but actually a policy fight, and they were to choose to vote and come out and vote, who tend to vote progressive. The data now tells us when poor and low wealth folk making less than $50,000 a year vote, they tend to vote progressive. What we saw, for instance, at the insurrection, were not, if you remember the news first came out, this was a bunch of poor and low wealth racist folk. Then somebody looked at the data and said, no, most of these folk were upper middle class people who've been caught up in white supremacy and other notions that somebody's taking something from them. So what we gotta do to reach folk is to reach them. That means you can't run a presidential election or Senate election and not put everything you have in the South, in these areas, not just in the South Black areas, but in poor areas like Harlan, Kentucky. The last presidential candidate to go to Harlan, Kentucky was Lyndon Baines Johnson for the beginning of the poor people's war on poverty. I was in Harlan County I was told if you go to Harlan County, they're going to run you out of there because it's a red county. We went back there in 2018 when there was a governor's race in Kentucky, and the governor of Kentucky will say this. We didn't endorse the candidates, but we went to all of those eastern counties and we brought people from Louisville to those counties. Go check the data. 3 of those counties flipped from so-called red counties. Why? Because we went in there and talked, and because the governor said, if you elect me, I'm gonna restore health care. I'm gonna deal with felony franchise. I'm gonna fight for living wages. So part of what it takes to reach people is to reach them in their point of pain, to reach them and not to believe a lot of the flippant kind of things people just say with no data behind it. The fact of the matter is poor and low wealth people are a major sleeping giant. And the last thing, Sister Brazil, is when we started planning for June 18th, somebody said, well, why are y'all going to the nation's capital to beg? We said, beg? They said, yeah, you begging folks. But no, paying somebody a living wage ain't begging. That's demanding what's right. What congressperson would work for less than a living wage? What congressperson would work without health care? What congressperson would work without a guaranteed pension? You see, we've got to flip the moral narrative, because when you see people demanding health care, when America is the only of the wealthiest, 25 wealthiest countries in the world that doesn't offer some form of universal health care to its people, and you got 87 million people walking around uninsured or uninsured. I didn't say Black people, 87 million Americans. Something is wrong if you see people demanding that as begging when the very politicians that vote against them having it have it themselves. And so what we're saying is this is not about begging. And we're also saying, America, this is not just about doing something for poor folks. If you do not address 43% of your nation living in poverty and low wealth, the foundations of this nation can't handle that tension but so long. If we get to 50% of people, we already at 52% of our children, poor and low wealth. The structures can't handle that level, the level of opulence and the level of poverty existing in the same reality, and it doesn't have to be. That's for formula, for autocrats and despots to run and dictators and people to fill folks' minds with a lot of craziness. Do you know, I was listening to Fox News the other night, because I do that sometimes. They calling it Democrats elitist. How you and claiming, and I know they're lying, but my point is, you can't write off. I don't know all the answers, but I know this. You can't write off a third. You've led a lot of campaigns, Donna, and I bet you never went into a meeting and said, now let's just forget a third of the folk over here. We got a third of the voters over here. We're just gonna write them off. Or we're just gonna take them for granted. Or we're just gonna tell them, remember what we did 50 years ago. Nobody would hire you to do that. And in this country, we cannot, at least we ought to be debating it. At least it ought to be on the table. At least we ought to say the name poor and low wealth. At least we ought to say we are not gonna stand for 140 million people existing in a reality that is unacceptable. I was at the UN with the special rapporteur on poverty. And he said to me, Reverend Barber, the lie of scarcity is a lie. We just did a study with Jeffrey Sachs. You know, the poor people died at a rate 3 to 5 times higher during the pandemic than other people, and the accelerant was not non-vaccination, but poverty. Think about that. It wasn't non-vaccination, it was poverty. And the fact that the government didn't keep the data on how the pandemic was impacting the poor, therefore the policies were not driven in those communities. And I'm talking about like a poor county in West Virginia or a poor county in the Delta. I'm not talking about race, I'm talking about poverty. And the rapporteur and all Jeffrey Sachs and our other economists that work with us said, the lie of scarcity is a lie. The lie of knowing what to do, we don't know what to do, is a lie. What is the truth is the lack of moral consciousness to do it. And that's why we have to have a movement, both political and moral, because they both go together, that not only says what is moral, but also builds power, which is why on June 18th, we're saying we're having a mass moral march on Washington. Notice what we say, and to the polls, because poor and low wealth people are deciding we're not going to wait anymore for a party to start talking about us, we're going to force everybody to have to talk about us because we're going to show our power. We're going to be there. We're going to mobilize. We're going to register. We're going to push.
Thank you, Reverend Barber. I know we might have wanted you to come on and talk about the future of the Democratic Party and the calendar that we face in 2024 and so many more issues, but your voice has always been a voice that has been a champion for those who have been least thought of, marginalized. And just want to say once again, thank you for all of the leadership you provide. And lastly, I got to say before I turn it over to Jim, and congratulations to my good friend Mian, I'm proud to still belong to a party that gave me in 1965 a head start in life, and a party that continues to invest in the future, and a party that can bring down poverty and also invest in the future of America's workforce, the future of American housing, sustainability, climate change, and so much more. Is a party that I want to be aligned with, a party that you and I are going to continue to challenge, to find this voice and this leadership to tackle some of these big issues. So God bless you, sir.
And Sister Donna, just 30 seconds. I want folk to hear that I am talking about 2022 and 2024 because the sleeping giant is awakening. I'm begging the party, don't write off your future.
Thank you.
The stone that the builders have rejected have the possibility now to be the chief cornerstones in building a new democracy and for us to finish the reconstructions that were never finished. But we can't leave folk out. We got to bring them in and speak clearly and powerfully. And we're committed to that kind of a democracy in this country. Love you all.
Love you too, my brother. God bless you. Jim?
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Reverend. Any other questions for Reverend Barber? Hearing none. Again, thanks for a very inspiring presentation, Reverend. Our next speaker is Stephanie Brown James, the co-founder and senior advisor of The Collective, a consortium of organizations including the Collective PAC and Collective Future, dedicated to recruiting, training, funding, and supporting Black candidates to run for office across the country. Founded in 2016, the Collective has raised over $6.5 million from more than 13,000 contributions and helped over 40 Black candidates with their elections, and launched the Black Campaign School to specifically train Black candidates and campaign operatives to win elections and better serve their communities. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. It is definitely an honor and a privilege to be with you all this evening. Couple of quick corrections in that bio. I'm grateful to say that in the last 6 years, the Collective PAC has helped to support 301 candidates to win their elections, and we've raised over $40 million in our efforts. And I wanted to say that because we realized very early on that in order to maximize our resources, maximize the support we could give to Black candidates who oftentimes feel as though they are lacking support around the country, we realized we had to open up a bigger tent and we had to expand opportunities. And I think that's exactly where we see ourselves with the party now.
Thank you for those good updates.
Yes. And one, I just want to also just say I'm very appreciative of, we had a chance recently to spend time with Chairman Harrison and members of the DNC team and to talk in depth about the plans that they have in reaching out to the community. And so we've already seen how the investments at the DNC and the planning has already started to bear fruit. The fact that the chairman would spend time with, we had 32 candidates together in Los Angeles for a Black Leadership Summit, and the time that they had to bend his ear and the staff's ear was vitally important. So I'm grateful for that. And quite frankly, that's what it's going to take. You know, I have to admit that I am not familiar with this process at all. And so when I first learned about the committee and the call and how I could possibly bring some thoughts to the conversation, I had to really make sure I looked and read all the materials that was provided, because so much of the process in picking the president happens behind the closed doors, but it happens with folks who I know want to figure out how we can expand the big tent, how we can make sure that our party reaches as many folks as possible. This last 2020 presidential cycle, I think, showed a lot of people how important this presidential calendar is. To see the caucuses take place in Iowa and to see them take place in Nevada and South Carolina, New Hampshire, it was so evident with so many candidates in place that, listen, I never had a problem with Iowa being, first up and how people would say Iowa is very white and it is not representative of the party. I actually didn't have a problem with Iowa. I think the challenge is, and kind of what I want to focus on today was, are we making sure that we are allowing as many people to participate in the process on the ground as possible? I am a working mother, and I could not imagine having to try to go to a caucus where I have to stand in line in hours and stand around and, while trying to figure out how my kids are going to be taken care of. Or I don't know how my mother, who is in her mid-70s, is going to have to figure out how in the world can she participate, in a caucus structure that, quite frankly, may be accessible, but is in no way comfortable. Or how is it that young people who don't hardly know anything about the process at all, nor do they oftentimes don't care about it, what's going to entice them to participate in a process that, isn't really spelled out from beginning to end? And so what I am looking forward to is, seeing a situation where we are inviting as many people to be a part of our table because we make it interesting and accessible and comfortable for them to participate. We are making sure, and I know this is a conversation specifically about the South. South Carolina showed how important it was in 2020. I think we are going to continue to see that. I'm sure North Carolina is biting at the heels to figure out how they can get early on the schedule. But, ultimately, are we doing everything we can so that those folks who traditionally find themselves or feel as though they find themselves on the outskirts of the party process are able to be involved? Our candidates, and we work with Black candidates on a local, state, and federal level, the trend we've seen with them over the last 6 years now, we've almost been in office, is that the majority of them do not come up through the party structure with regards to the offices that they're running for. And that is whether they're running for a federal seat or whether they are running for a local city council seat. They do not have existing relationships within the party. So then therefore, they don't oftentimes feel engaged in the party structure and somewhat look at the process with regards to the presidential process as one where they are not invited to participate. So I think being able to have conversations with folks now in preparation for 2024, these candidates, while they may not be a part of the party structure, they have a lot of insight as they travel their districts, they travel their states. And so being able to tap into them, I think, is a real resource. And then again, how are we making sure that while we have a process in place, we are staying very much true to our principles? Our principles are around diversity, are around access, are around democracy. And the folks right now who feel very left out of that process are working people, those who are older and have less ability to move around, young people, and men. And we've heard a lot about specifically men of color. 2020 was an alarm was sounded that we have a challenge with engaging Black men in the political process. But the challenge is definitely an opportunity that we can get right for 2024. And so having those intentional conversations with Black men in communities, and you can even start it with these candidates and electeds that we have in place, but being intentional about going after, I think those are really the four, what I see as four kind of big ticket communities: young people, those who are have less mobility, Black men in the working class, especially working mothers, I think is a tremendous opportunity to engage with those communities now and have conversations with them now to fully explain the process so they understand how it works, and have their expectations met when it comes time for the presidential process to fully begin. So I will pause there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it's a very important message for us to keep in mind. Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Branson?
I don't see any hands, Jim.
All right, thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Stephanie, for delivering that message to us. Important voice for us to hear. I'll turn it back to my co-chair.
Thank you, Stephanie, and it's always good to see you. And I'm glad you're engaged in the process because you have been a member of the Democratic family for far too long. And so having transparency and access is something that Jim and Lorraine has always strived for. So I think you are proving the point that they have worked so hard to establish. So thank you for sharing your words of wisdom as always. Now I get the pleasure of introducing, I would consider him a mentee. I'm sure Donna would consider him a mentee, but he also is the son of a powerful former chair and the person who appointed me as the political director for the DNC and who really propelled my career forward to the White House. I am proud to introduce his son, who is very active in the party from California. He comes to us with a law degree, White House and FCC experience, 20 years of Silicon Valley. Donnie has a strong and electric record in tech business development as a founder and national political strategist. Since 2016, Donnie has led Tech for America, a bridge between Silicon Valley and public leaders that includes a partnership with the National League of Cities. He is co-founder of Democracy Labs, a workshop for techies, creatives, and politicos to put their tools in the hands of groups and candidates. Donnie also teaches at the University of San Francisco and is on the board of Save the Bay and the New Leaders Council. I am proud to present to us the son of and a powerhouse in his own right, Donnie Fowler Jr.
Oh, Mignon, you stole my own opening because I was going to tell you how fortunate I am to get to talk to several of my teachers. Donna told me when I was a 19-year-old, she said, be nice to the kids because one day you might be working for listening to them. So I count you and Donna and Carol and so many of the rest of you as teachers and keepers of mine over the years. So thanks for letting me have a few minutes. I'm talking to you from the University of San Francisco, a very progressive Jesuit university where I teach advocacy and campaigns about once a year. And I have on my South Carolina Gamecock shirt underneath. So I always remember my roots and I know where I am now, but it reminds me always, USF always reminds me that I am a Democrat because I am a Christian and not despite my faith. Let me get down to brass tacks. I have been really, among the fortunate teachers, I've also been really, really happy and fortunate that I've gotten to work in 3 Iowa caucuses, in 4 New Hampshire primaries, and 5 different elections in South Carolina over the years. I've worked on the ground in 17 states as a staff member of mostly presidential campaigns since I was Donna's intern in 1987, and most recently Donna's intern when she was interim chair in 2016. So 35 years and counting, Donna. And for Gore, I was his national field director and his delegates director in the 1999-2000 cycle. So I'm happy to give you a few of my perspectives on this nominating process. One is that we produce better candidates because of it. 2 is that it's a training ground for some of the best operatives we continue to have in the party. And 3, a couple of thoughts on delegate selection that Carol Fowler told me to mention. On better candidates, let me say that in my experiences in these early states, the worst candidates come out of the nominating process, especially the early states, better candidates, and the great candidates come out even better. Why is that? First of all, these are small states with small electorates, as you know. They have to talk to real people. They can't just do politics on the morning shows and on the tarmacs and in donors' dining rooms. They cannot just talk to political reporters and big party operatives. And because it forces, especially these senators who run, to be in the face of regular voters and activists, it makes them come back down to earth, quite frankly. I have yet to see a candidate go through the early state process and not be better than when he or she started. Second, the way that you all in particular have scheduled the early states in the last few election cycles has produced the kind of diversity that did not exist when I first did my cycles in 1988 with Dick Gephardt and Jesse Jackson's campaigns. So whatever states go first, they should continue to reflect the diversity that Nevada, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Iowa currently represent. And I think that's extremely important, mostly because it provides validity to the process. It provides validity. Third, the process to run in these early states is in real contrast to the process to run in the Super Tuesday states and afterwards. Why is that? It's a very long runway to get to Election Day, and especially in Iowa, New Hampshire, a very long runway, meaning in all the times I've been in these early states, especially Iowa, New Hampshire, the campaign staffs are built 9 months to 12 months or longer in advance. So there is significant organizing, significant training, significant opportunity for activists and candidates and their surrogates to get better. That long runway lets us also do a lot of testing of different techniques, tactics that actually accrue to our benefit in the general elections. Finally, the early states, because the early states are small, you can do this very long runway with fewer resources than if you had to do it in medium, bigger states like a North Carolina, a Michigan, or a California or Texas. So these early states produce better candidates for lots of reasons, and they produce better campaign staff for lots of reasons. And that's my second point. Training ground. Some of the people who are running our party now and who are running the White House now were field staff in prior Iowa, New Hampshire elections. Guy Cecil, who runs Priorities USA, and Jen O'Malley both were on my field staff team in 1996 and 2000, and now they are at the very top of the game and the top of our party. Jeremy Byrd and John Carson were national field directors for Obama. They both worked in South Carolina and Iowa primaries and caucuses. There were unlimited general election state directors that get their training in these early states with long runways and intense organization. So the second point is that these early states and the process we have now provides a training ground that does not exist anywhere else at any other time in our party. And to dispense with that is to literally pull the rug out under training the best talent for the next election and the best talent for the next generation of leaders. Third, Carol said I should say something about delegate selection, which I have been through once as Al Gore's National Film Delegates Director in 2000, and second as the floor whip lead in the Philadelphia Convention in 2016. I called it the chief family counselor for the Democratic Party. 40% of Bernie people wanted to kill 60% of Hillary people, and vice versa. But whether you call it whip or family counselor, it doesn't matter. There are a few things that I've observed as an operative in the delegate selection process that I found to be extremely helpful to the party. The first is I recommend that you keep it very flexible for campaigns, the candidates and their campaigns. Keep it very flexible for them to make choices and give rewards to the people who have supported them from the beginning but to continue to demand the diversity that the current rules demand of our National Convention delegates. And finally, this all comes together to allow these candidates and campaigns to reward the folks who have fought for them on the ground from the very beginning of their candidacies, all the way through that National Convention. In short, I can give you lots of war stories, as y'all can give me lots of war stories about delegate selection and national conventions. But one that I recall is the work I had to do working for Al Gore with Bill Bradley's appointee in 2000. The flexibility that we had after filling out our delegate slates, the flexibility that we had on the Gore campaign to reward and give Bill Bradley's campaign a soft landing by assigning and reassigning delegates that were his stronger supporters actually allowed us to create a convention that was 100% unanimous for Al Gore. Despite the fact that Bill Bradley didn't win a single state, it was a very important part of the deal that Al Gore cut with Bill Bradley to get out of the race. It was allowing us to manage delegates and give Bill Bradley some soft landing. So that's an example of flexibility. Example of the diversity. You know, I think everybody on this call knows how hard diversity is, that even if we say we want diversity, it doesn't mean it's going to happen, even in our party with the most well-meaning people in our party. And so the absolute requirements to demand diversity really, really require these campaigns to double back and triple back and look again and find somebody new who hasn't been in the process yet, who hasn't been at the convention yet, who hasn't felt that they have an ownership of this party yet. It really requires these campaigns to deliver on that benefit to all of us. So, you know, if you really want to talk about delegate process, you all know Dave Wynn, Delegate Dave, and I would never speak. I would always go to him first and not to me for that. But let me sum it up by saying, you know, I think that the process we have now, whatever states you use, make better candidates, because we should keep the states small. We should make sure there's diversity across the combination of those early states. The campaigns have a long runway to build campaigns, to meet voters, to become better candidates. And it doesn't require the kind of resources to do all that really, really indispensable work. Second, the way we have the process now, the long runway in particular in small states, gives us a training ground that we do not have anywhere else in this party. We don't. I've never seen it. I know there are other great ways to train operatives and candidates, but there's nothing like training on the ground in these early states. There just isn't. And to take that away is going to be a tremendous, tremendous disservice. And third, my delegate selection idea is keep it flexible, demand diversity, and allow campaigns to reward their own people and those of the candidates that are withdrawing. So thanks a lot. I really am flattered that y'all asked me to do this.
Well, thank you, Donnie. Thank you so much for giving us those words of wisdom from a person that's been out in the field and sees how this actually happens on the ground. So I will see if Veronica has any question. Well, we do have a question from Carol Fowler, sharing the same last name.
But not the same technical skills. You're on mute, Carol. Come out here to Silicon Valley and I'll help you.
Oh, thanks. Donnie understands how challenged I am technically, but not as challenged as his dad was. You have to realize that. But no, I just want to thank Donnie for talking about a good many of the things that we as a committee are going to be talking about. And I was thinking while Donnie was talking that maybe we need to invite him to one of our meetings to talk to everybody on the RBC about the kind of early process we need to be coming up with. So really, I just wanted to talk to Donnie. So I didn't have anything too smart to say, but thanks, Donnie, for doing that.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much. Veronica, are there any more questions for Donnie?
No, I see no others.
Excellent. It was such a good presentation. No one has any questions.
We've reached the end of our journey here. So Jim, I think I will turn it back over to you, even though that is not what's on the script, but I want to turn it back over to the esteemed leader, who I am now his co-partner, and I want to thank him again. And I look forward to serving with you. It is truly an honor and privilege to be at your side. So, and again, in Lorraine's absence, I want to thank her for all that she did to prepare me to get to this point, to be sitting next to you and chair, Jim. So,
I will always miss Lorraine, but you are a true partner, and sometime I'll turn it back over to you unexpectedly. Yeah, this has been a very comprehensive session. I think bringing a lot of views from this region of the country to us that we need to hear. There'll be 3 more of these sessions. If you look at the announcements, you're welcome to listen to them and watch them as well. But thank you, everybody, for participating today, not just the people who appeared on camera, but everyone from the Rules and Bylaws Committee who participated and those who tuned in to watch and listen. Thank you to our great staff, both in the Secretary's office and in the Office of Party Affairs. And thank you to Chair Harrison for kicking us off here. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you at our next meeting.